We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. I grew up in the suburb, Park Ridge, suburb of Chicago. And I was Mary Seat of Wisdom, grew up Catholic. I was very involved with the youth group. And that, so I was involved in, as a high school student, the United Farm Workers. I went to a Lenten mission at Mary Seat of Wisdom, and the United Farm Workers spoke as a part of that week-long mission. And they talked about the horrific conditions in the field. It's when I first learned about Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta as the co-founders of the United Farm Workers movement. My family, along with the church, were involved in the boycotting Gallo wine and grapes and head lettuce. I leafleted through that. I was inspired. And I also, as a high school student, learned through the Eighth Day Center for Justice about the Nestle boycott and the injustice of Nestle, which was a product in our home. The infant milk formula and, kind of pushing women in developing nations to not breastfeed and to use this powder from Nestle, which then they couldn't afford, and it was with not clean water, and it was a horrible condition. So I connected that with the farm workers. This was another injustice, so I became involved in the Nestle boycott in high school and then continued that in college. And in college, I got more involved with the United Farm Workers. I met Cesar Chavez. I was involved in picketing down in Bloomington. I went to Illinois State University. Right, so in 1980, I finished college and I moved to Chicago. And in part, I came to the neighborhood, which is now the CRLN office neighborhood, because of the Catholic Worker House, which is just a few blocks away, the St. Francis Catholic Worker, and learned about the injustices in Central America. And teaching at St. Thomas of Canterbury, many of my students they're from all over the world, heavy refugee population, but many of them were from Central America. And in particular, Miguel Munoz was from Guatemala. He and I started singing together, and it was through that work and learning more about Central America, in part because of the activism and being involved with the Pledge of Resistance and the School of the Americas Watch, that I became connected with CRLN and saw that CRLN, at that time, that we was specifically Gary as staff, but were committed. They're committed to being in the trenches, doing the work. In fact, one of the things that I remember about Gary, not just in the early years, but in the decades that followed, is I always wanted to be in the streets and doing the activism. And Gary would always be reminding us about the legislative work and the importance of having the legislative voices be a part of the actions that we were a part of, be a part of the demonstrations, that the work that we were doing needed to be legislative as well as active. And I think that's a very important message and mentoring that I learned from CRLN. The power and growth of this collective of congregations to trust one another. It's kind of what I said earlier about in the 1980s, these different organizations working together so much that this trust formed where people could just assume that they could depend on each other. And the immigrant welcoming congregations is that kind of family. It's that kind of a community.